Good.
Okay.
Okay, so I'm going to record this meeting so we can share it with those who aren't able to make it with us today, but happy for those of you who are here. We have Taun, and remind me how you say your last name.
Bettis. It just sounds like
Bettis.
lettuce.
Okay, Taun Bettis, and he is primarily out of Utah and Juab counties. He helps with those counties, and he's going to be teaching us about growing vegetables. And I think he's going to do a really good job about touching on our short growing season in Rich County. And so I will give the time over to him. Oh, and then one thing too. In the chat, he attached the slides from his meeting today. So if you want that and print it out, it's in the chat so you can access that. But other than that, I will turn the time over to Ton. Feel free to ask him any questions that you want. I'll be monitoring the chat throughout the meeting. All right,
Cool.
thank you, Ton.
So we'll get started. I am based out of Juab and Utah counties. You may have heard our conversation earlier, but I lived up in Logan for 5 years when I first started with USU and really liked it up there. I spent a little bit of time over toward Garden City and Randolph helping when needed with horticulture stuff, but really enjoyed the area quite a bit. I've been with USU about, I think, 17 or 18 years now, and um, just really enjoy working with plants and just working with the public. So, Reagan, can you see my screen? Is it shared correctly?
Yes, it looks good.
Okay. Okay. So, I want to talk about preparation and then timing and then what to plant. And because of your short growing season, I've tried to detail this presentation toward things that have will ripen in a growing season of around 60 days. And so we'll also talk quite a bit about season extension and cold frames and things so that you could probably add another 30 or 40 days to your growing season. So, all right. And this is pretty obvious, but use you need a sunny location for your vegetables with a minimum of 6 or 7 hours a day. People sometimes try to garden on the east side of their home, and that's okay as long as it's more toward the southeast if it's up against a building. And but on the west is fine and the south is fine. Most of our vegetables, well, all of them are going to want um, a full sun exposure. So let's talk about soil. And down here on the Wasatch Front, there's a lot of construction. And one of the things I hear quite a bit is, oh, my soil is so crappy. Probably not. My camera is glitching a little bit. So if you see that, I apologize. I might turn it off for now. I think I will. Stop. There we go. But you'll get this is like, oh, my soil is so crappy, I can't dig in it. I need to haul in topsoil, and you usually don't. What I would recommend doing is soil testing, to where you collect several samples from the area that you want to garden, go down 3 or 4 inches just to get any debris on the soil surface, and then get 4 or 5 samples, mix it up in a bucket. And then you need 2 measuring cups that you would mail over to the USU soil lab. And you want the routine test, and the website is usual.usu.edu. So just the word usual.usu.edu, and have them test it. And even if you have some clay in there, it's usually just fine for vegetable gardening. And so the best way to improve soil is not to haul topsoil in, but it's to add organic matter and compost. And the recommendation is about 2 to 3 inches of compost mixed in or tilled into the soil 6 inches deep. The best time to actually do this is in the fall, so that the compost has a chance to break down and do what you want it to do. You can put a little bit more down in the spring, but the fall is the best time to put down compost. And once you're happy with your soil, if you add 1 inch of compost annually, it'll maintain the soil you have. And so you don't need to go and get the fancy, like high class composts. There's they'll sometimes actually see them advertised with bat guano or Madagascar elephant dung. It all breaks down into the same stuff. And so just find a good, inexpensive compost. And if you do have questions and want to get brave, you can unmute, and I'm happy to answer during the presentation. So, all right. So, what does compost do for us? And improves drainage of high clay soils. And then it improves water holding capacity in sandy soils. It reduces compaction. We want airspace in that soil. And if the soil is compacted, you don't have it. And it provides nutrients to plants and animals. And so animals would be grazers or animals that would eventually get those too. And then it improves what's called soil tilth, and that's the ease of how easy it is to till and work the soil. A lot of times people assume their soil is really bad because it's the middle of July. We haven't had rain for weeks, and they try to dig, and the only way they can dig through the soil is with a pick. But if you were to dig that soil in the spring and we had some soil moisture, it would be just fine. And so here's an example of soil tilth. You can see these there was an old community garden in Hyde Park, and this bottom, let me turn on my highlighter here. This bottom bed right here that I'm circling has been worked for 4 or 5 years and had lots of compost added. You can see how the rows are straight, there's no clods in it. And over here, this soil had never been worked. And you can see not just the plant debris. I wish I would have blown this picture up bigger, but it's just not in very good shape compared to the one where we have mixed in a lot of compost. So that's an example of tilth. So growing plants, what to add and ways to preserve organic matter. Put organic matter back into the soil. So if your vegetables will put a certain amount of organic matter back into the soil, just some of the roots and other debris. You can use leaf litter, then mulching around perennials, and even like if you use grass clippings in your garden, those will break down into the soil at about a rate of 1 inch per year. And so I don't have it in this presentation, but for weed control, grass clippings are great to use in your garden. And then you can always add extra organic matter to gardens and other planting areas that you just purchased from like a Walmart or a garden center IFA or something. Okay, so wood residue, if you use, a lot of times people will ask, well, my husband has access to wood chips from an arborist or wood shavings from a mill company or something, or he knows a carpenter and has sawdust. You don't want to use a lot of that. And if you do, don't put more than 1 inch or so down. And then you're going to want to mix in some extra fertilizer, because that, as it breaks down, robs the soil of nitrogen, and it'll make it actually so that your garden fails because there's no available nitrogen, because it's all taken up for the decomposition of the wood products. And so grass or green leaves are great. And then compost and animal manures in moderation. You need to be careful with animal manure because, especially horses, if you have too many horses on a pasture, they have a tendency to really destroy a pasture, and then you get all sorts of weeds in there, and many of those weed seeds, when they consume the plants, are not destroyed in the digestive tract. And then you go spread raw horse manure in the fall, disc it or till it in, and all of a sudden you have so many weeds that you never had before. And so if I'm using manure from a local farmer, I always try to get dairy manure because those cows are princesses in a lot of ways. And there's very little weed material in the pastures or the hay. So, or if it's horse, I will always go kind of surreptitiously drive past the pastures and see what kind of shape they're in. And if there's very little grass in the pastures, I won't use that manure. And so sometimes composts and animal manure itself can be fairly rich in salt. And, and that's another reason if you need to do the 3 inches, I recommend doing it in the fall because you'll have all winter for that to break down and you'll leach a lot of those salts out of the manure that are mixed into the soil. Okay. So just really quick, we've already talked about some of this, and a single application, 1 inch per year will kind of just maintain what you have. 2 to 3 inches of low salt material. If your soil is just really hard, it becomes compacted really easily. Brand new garden space, and you're converting it from sagebrush to a garden, it would be a good idea if you can to mix in that compost. Then just a rule of thumb, a 3 cubic yards will spread over about 3 inches deep over 1,000 square feet. But if you want to reverse engineer that a little bit, 1 cubic yard will do a 10 by 10 area 3 inches deep. Oh, excuse me. I hope I haven't confused you. You would 1 inch of material. So if you want to do compost 1 inch deep, 3 cubic yards over 1,000 square feet, you would need to add a lot more to get the 3 inches. But the rule of thumb is if per cubic yard, it will do a 10 by 10 area 3 inches deep. And so if you bought 3 cubic yards, that's 300 feet, or excuse me, 3 cubic yards, 300 square feet, 3 inches deep. And so that's one way I kind of keep things straight. I'll just walk off the area. A step, kind of a long step, is 3 feet. And if I've got three or four steps by 3 or 4 steps in a square, I need 1 cubic yard of bulk material. Okay, a little bit more about manure products. If you have pets, don't use pet manure in your garden. The reason being is they sometimes carry diseases that you don't want to get that can transfer to your vegetables, and they smell, and you increase the likelihood of getting other predator animals, whether it's just other dogs and cats, or if there's stuff coming out of the wild that will come in and mark their territory in your garden. And then even like dairy, if I get asked all the time, I have 20-year-old powdered milk, can I just put it out there? And the recommendation is no, don't do it. So, okay, weed control. Just with a garden, staying on top of the weeds are always better. um, Hand pulling if it's a small garden, hoeing it out. There's little mechanical cultivators. There's all sorts of things you can do. As far as herbicides, I'm not too thrilled about using herbicides in my garden just because that's where I grow my food. And so if I use an herbicide, it's in the fall when I'm done gardening, 2 or 3 weeks ahead of hard frost, and I just spray the weeds out, and I've got all winter and spring for whatever I sprayed in there to dissipate. And then I don't want to discount the value of mulches because a good application of grass mulch, 2 to 3 inches thick, will eliminate about 80% of your weeding. So, okay, now we're getting into some things I wanted to talk about. Due to how short your growing season is, you don't necessarily need to put up like this big structure here in the middle. It's sometimes overkill if you're just wanting a few tomatoes or something, but notice this one on the left and how small it is. I'll circle that where you can see it a little bit, but something like that is very doable. You can pick up parts online, or if you're ever over in Logan or Evanston, farm stores and garden centers will carry a lot of this material. And something like this on the left, if you put normally you put your tomatoes out sometime in early to mid June. If you used a cold frame like this, you could get them out in mid to late May. It would give you between 2 and 4 weeks of growing season. And that's huge because there are many tomatoes that, if they can get about 90 days frost free, that will give you a really good harvest. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that. And this is more of a commercial situation, but this is a research greenhouse in Kaysville. Actually, that might be at Greenville. It doesn't matter. But they have 72 tomatoes planted in there. They got 10 pounds of tomatoes per plant. And so this gave them 720 pounds of tomatoes, which is over a quarter ton of tomatoes over the growing season. So, Garden City, Randolph, those areas, I would hedge my expectations a bit, but something like these high tunnels would increase your ability to grow food immensely if you wanted to put something in that big. So here's just another idea. This is a home gardener that has several things in their high tunnel. During the summer, when it gets above 80, this plastic, you drag the sides up. And let me switch. Let's see, highlighter, color, and we'll go to blue. But they have sections in here. But when we're regularly to above 80 degrees, this plastic is lifted up or just taken off. And they're using greenhouse grade plastic that will last in the sun 4 or 5 years, because this cold frame in here can get up to 40 or 50 degrees hotter than the outdoor temperature. And so if it's 70 outside, it could easily be 100 to 110 degrees, especially up here toward the top. And so to offset that, the sides of the plastic are dragged up, or it's just taken off and put back on in the fall for your situation sometime late August, so that, and you might have to keep it open and do some management, but that would help you be able to garden through September. So this is just an example of Victorian England. These are all glass cloches, and there's a head of lettuce under every one. And this is winter growing, but it's not that you need to do this, but it is something, just an example of what you can do to extend your growing season out. Okay, here's another one. Don't try to create an endless summer. Instead, work with the growing season. It's easier to extend the growing season than it is to grow clear through the winter. And all the time, people will ask, well, we want to put in a greenhouse so we can have winter tomatoes. And even like a 10 by 15 greenhouse, where you have to heat it, and then in the winter use supplemental lighting, and we're not just talking like just bulbs, but street lamp type lighting, to be able to grow tomatoes, plus your ventilation, because it does get a lot hotter in there. It will cost you a couple hundred to several $100s a month during the winter to run that greenhouse. And so what I tell people, if they want fresh winter vegetables, is that they should probably just spend the money on an all-inclusive resort in southern Mexico and just go down there and enjoy the fresh produce and enjoy it. So you can grow on a limited basis, and would be a different class, but you can grow indoors on a very limited basis, greens and micro tomatoes and things like that. But it's just not economical to grow mini vegetables in the winter in Utah. Okay, let's look at container and raised bed gardening, because containers are something that you might be able, if you were going to get some frost in late August through early September and then warm back up, you could just move this stuff to a shed or an unheated, or a garage or something, and put it back out. But containers are very useful if you lack space. your soil is just so bad. And there are situations that we have salty soils or the soil so rocky that you can't till it, you know, or if you are getting to a point in life that it's getting difficult to bend over, bend your hips and knees, then raised beds and container gardening can be a lifesaver because you can adapt to those things so that you can continue to garden. So, okay, some principles for containers. Um, they're really similar to raised beds, which we haven't gotten into yet. Let me back up really quick. Okay. So in containers, you always want a commercial potting soil. You can get a container mix or an outdoor mix, but you don't use your native garden soil in a container because it's so heavy that it compacts and things just don't grow in it well. And a bagged potting soil is so light and fluffy that you can grow plants in there. And then container material is less important as long as it has drainage holes at the bottom. That's the main thing. I think we talk about this later, but if you think you have a container big enough for whatever you're growing, generally double the size. So we have some lists in here later of adapted vegetables to containers and things, and I've so we'll look at that. And then watering, even up in Rich County, if we're getting in the high 80s to low 90s, you may need to water every day. And then as far as fertilizer, you can use a Miracle Grow type product, or you can use something that's called Osmocote, and that's Osmocote. And there's comparable brands, but they're slow release. And I would use like a 6 month release. I know your growing season isn't that long, but the slow release fertilizers have a tendency to release a lot of nitrogen for the first half of the expected life, and then it really tapers off toward the last. And so I always assume that a 6 month slow release fertilizer for containers lasts about 3 months. And so just keep that in mind. You can use about anything to garden in as long as it has space for soil. I actually used to see people use straw bales for raised beds, and or they would cut out straw from the straw bale and put potting soil in it. I think that's a waste of a straw bale, but I've seen people do it. The size of your raised beds will determine what you can grow, but they can help because the soil in raised beds warms up sooner. You can actually extend your gardening season a little bit because if you were to stick a kitchen thermometer in here, let's say this would be 50 degrees, draw 50 with my mouse and my weak hand. But this down here, if you stuck a thermometer in, might be 40. And so raised beds have a tendency to warm up faster. You can use wood, ceramic, plastic, cement, whatever. One thing I will say about metal roofing, people are using that quite a bit. I recommend painting it white because it heats up so much that roots adjacent to it are killed 3 or 4 inches in to a raised bed because the soil gets so hot. Okay, just some examples of different containers. This might looks like a glorified Walmart shopping bag. This is a colander. That isn't really what that lettuce looks like. That's staged, but it gives you an idea. Just a plastic gardening pot there. So as far as raised bed construction, construction grade lumber. So these would be the 2x4s and 4x4s that you purchase from a lumber yard just to work on your house. They're the least expensive wood product. And that 5 to 7 years is if you haven't put a preservative on there. There are some garden safe preservatives out there. Linseed oil is one of them. And so if you spray it with linseed oil, and especially if you're willing to clean the raised bed out once a year and put the soil on a tarp and then brush it off and respray it every year to 2 years on the inside and out, you can actually get 15 or 20 years out of construction lumber with that extra work. I don't usually recommend pressure treated lumber for gardening just because the pressure treated lumber is a lot safer now, but it it may leach things into the soil. And so it's just one that's not my favorite. If you're growing ornamental plants in it, like petunias and things like that, that's fine because you're not eating them. And then cedar and redwood will last between 10 and 20 years. When you use cedar and redwood and you can sort through the boards, find boards that are made that are cut from the heartwood. Sometimes they're actually picked out and sold at a higher price, but a lumber yard like Home Depot, Lowe's isn't likely to do that. And so if you can sort through and separate the heartwood from the sapwood, heartwood gives you 30 or 40% more life than the sapwood. PVC and vinyl fencing, you can buy kits online and from box stores and it's basically the fencing material just scaled down for a raised bed. It has a tendency to bow out and sometimes becomes brittle, but it's fine. Metal roofing, we've already mentioned. And then the most permanent would be some sort of masonry where they're using bricks, wall blocks, rock walls, cement. So, and that's going to be the most permanent. Okay, raised bed construction. You want soil in the raised bed at least 6 inches deep, preferably a foot. The raised beds need to be able to drain. And if you can, try not to use filler materials because sometimes you'll build like a 3 foot tall raised bed and that gets very expensive to fill. And instead of using like this example here in the picture, like using logs and stuff like that, I prefer to use cobble. So fist size rock cobble and fill the raised bed up with it until you can get a good foot to 18 inches of soil. If you do need to fill those up a bit, that's going to be better than anything else. And then avoid gimmicky gardening techniques, lasagna gardening, square foot gardening. It's not that these don't work, but a lot of times you pay more money for the same amount of vegetables. And so these systems are designed for limited areas like square foot gardening, and they're fine. It's just like, especially with like mint lighter, you pay a lot of money for what you get out of it. So, okay, there's not a magic soil mix, but for me, if I've got extensive raised beds, and you may have to go over to Logan, but there is a pit right on the border in Lewiston, I think, that an excavation pit that they sell sandy loam or sandy soil. And I would get that sandy soil and then get an equivalent volume of compost, mix the two together, and then that's what's going into my raised bed. If you have to get that from Logan or Lewiston to Garden City or Randolph, you probably would want like an F-250 or something because that soil can be a little heavy. But that's going to be the cheapest raised bed mix that grows fantastic produce. Otherwise, you can get commercial raised bed mix in bags or bales. You can get it loose. You expect to pay about $80 a cubic yard if you get it loose, but that's just the going price for it. Now, if you use that Lewiston soil mixed with compost, it's deficient in phosphorus and potassium. And so I will, if I use that mix, I get triple 16 and I mix that or I apply that at the recommended rate to the raised beds. And um, then what that does is it puts phosphorus and potassium back into that soil. Okay, irrigation. The raised beds are going to need to be watered more often just because the soil is loose in them. The soil dries out more quickly. And so I like to use drip in the raised beds. You can just use a hose with a hose in nozzle that won't blow the soil out. But this is inline drip over here. And we're making sure that they're pressure compensating because if you run that line and it's not perfectly flat or have a gradual elevation decrease, if you get some wowies where it goes up and down a little bit, where it's high like this, those drip emitters won't emit very well. And where it's low, you get way too much water. And so pressure compensating emitters offset that. And then with pressure compensating, if you get these wowies where it's not perfectly flat, they also compensate for that. So there's lots of other forms you can use, but those are the easiest two, are just hose watering or inline drip. And these will have an emitter every 6 inches to foot on there. And it just, as it goes into the soil, it doesn't go straight down, but it kind of forms a fan shape. And so even though the top might look dry, as that water spreads in the soil, you're getting more of something like this. And so just an inch or two down, you're getting a good spread on the water. Okay, so you can use mulches in your raised bed in your garden. I've talked about it a couple times, but there's all sorts of options. Help keep the weeds down, help conserve water a little bit, but there's all sorts of things you can use. Now, the one here that I'm cautious about is carpet. And I see gardeners sometimes put carpet between their rows. And the carpet is made out of petroleum products and they use chemicals on it to keep it so that you can clean it easily, so it stays flexible and doesn't get brittle. And those are forever chemicals and those can get into the soil. And for the latest research I'm seeing, I'm not too freaked out about it, but the latest research is overexposure to forever chemicals causes a lot of kidney inflammation and maybe digestive tract inflammation. And so I would just leave the carpet out. All right. So raised bed design, sometimes you don't even need a and in some way to contain it. These are just raised beds that they've heaped up the soil and made great big furrows. Somebody mentioned the other day when I was teaching this that for Halloween, all you need is a tombstone. We'll put one in, but this is fine. This soil on the top will heat up more quickly. And if you have a clay soil and you're mixing in a lot of compost, water drains away better. But these are great for raised beds. Okay, so for Garden City, Randolph, and those areas where your growing season is less than 90 days, you have fewer days than 90, a system like this, and you don't have to have this on top of a raised bed, but these are hoops. And on the Wasatch Front, we're getting so hot that temperatures above 90 cause flower abortion and it halts fruit development in many situations. And so a lot of gardeners are starting to use these shade cloths, and the grade of them is 20 to 30% shade. And what this does for you is we have so much sunlight that small amount of shade isn't going to hurt any vegetable production. But what it does is it cools things down and you get fruit sometimes 2 to 3 weeks earlier. But what I'm more pointing out here is you could put plastic over these hoops and then get these sides kind of walled up a little bit. And, come this May, in early May, you could have that on there and heat the soil up and leave it on until late September. And all of a sudden, you have another 40 days, 50 days that you can grow crops. And so this is becoming, it's just something I recommend doing if you live in areas where it's either too hot or too cold. Okay, let's look at the next one. Another trick you can use in cool season areas, and I'm going to change my highlighter color again. Let's see if yellow works, is planting in black plastic. And unfortunately, the plastic isn't recyclable, but what it will do will change that pin color a little. I guess you can see that just fine. But down the middle of that plastic, you would put holes and you would grow things like peas, green beans, maybe short season squash if you can find it, short season corn. When those plants are younger, this black plastic heats up and it gets them growing faster. You can put drip irrigation underneath here. It keeps your weeds down a little bit. And then in the fall, the black plastic heats up enough again that it will help a little bit, give you some heat, but it doesn't heat up so much that it harms the soil. So I'm not going to talk too much about these other things. We've already mentioned them. So now let's get into some vegetables. So I want to talk really briefly about the difference of open pollinated and hybrid plants. Open pollinated plants are heirloom by default. And if you collect the seeds, the open pollinated plants will come back true to type. And so tomatoes and peppers are the easiest plants to do this with, but open pollinated plants are what grandma and grandpa were using. With them having viable seed that you can just collect, there's some trade offs in that they are oftentimes a little bit more disease susceptible and you get lower productivity out of them. And so that's the trade. And so hybrid plants are still the same species. You know, it's just that they've, let's say, for celebrity tomato, they've crossed two different strains of tomato to get celebrity, and the first generation is stable. But if you collect celebrity tomato and plant the seeds, they come back as something different and it'll be inferior to what you started with. So let's see. But a lot of times hybrids have increased disease and pest resistance and increased productivity. So just the way that we recommend when to plant usually isn't by calendar dates. It's more along the lines of just knowing when your first and last frosts are, or last and first frost. And so these crops right here can be planted anywhere from 60 to 30 days before your last frost. These here are 30 to 45 days before your last frost. So beets, lettuce, potatoes, cauliflower, and parsley. Now, some of these, like potatoes, you may not get a full harvest out of that. You know, an area that's fairly similar to your growing season is the Teton Valley up in Driggs, that area. And they grow seed potatoes up there that will get almost like a baby potato, but a little larger, but you don't get the big 3 or 4 inch wide baker to potatoes that you get with a longer growing season. And then cauliflower, you want to find short season cauliflower, and then carrots, short season carrots too. Now, I don't have some of these in here, but I just wanted to point that out. Okay, after your last frost, these are the crops that you would do, but you may not be able to find short season versions for all of these that will do their thing up in Rich County. And so squash might be out, melons are probably out that I'm kind of lining through. Eggplants might be out. I don't know why anyone would want to plant eggplant anyway. I will repent. I am sorry if you like eggplant. Um, Maybe we'll scribble it out some more. Let's see, ink color, red. There we go. Yeah, that's just out. But anyway, all of these others you may find short season versions of. So when you are planting your vegetables, USU has fact sheets on almost everything you would want to grow, everything imaginable. And so if you will just do a Google search or whatever search engine you prefer of, say, beets, you just go USU beets in the garden or USU corn in the garden, and it gives you exactly how to grow it. And I've got some examples here of that. Like it says tomatoes prefer all this stuff here, but then before planting, incorporate 4 inches of well composted organic matter, apply 4 to 6 cups of all purpose fertilizer per 100 square feet That could be 100 feet of row, but it tells you exactly what to do, and they're all free. Gives you watering instructions and harvest instructions and disease instructions. And so let's talk about some vegetables. And so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on heirloom, and let's more focus on stuff that you might be able to grow in Rich County and ripen. So tomatoes, a lot of the tomatoes that you would use for a really short growing season were actually bred in places like northern Canada and Russia. There are some bred in the United States also, but all of these have a 60-day or shorter harvest time, but that is assuming that you're buying starts. And so a lot of these are uncommon, although you can find the seeds online. And again, this is a presentation for another time, but you would start these indoors 6 weeks before you plant them outside, and they would go outside in early to mid June. And so you would start them in mid April to late April so that you can get them planted. But I would still plant them into that black plastic. And especially if you have a 60 or 70-day tomato, then I would consider the plastic hoops over the top so that you can get a better harvest. But of these, I've grown 4th of July. And on the Wasatch Front, it ripens in mid July. I've grown Glacier here, and I haven't grown it, but I know about Oregon Spring. On these other ones, I looked them up yesterday, and they have a shorter growing season, but these are the three I have experience with. And 4th of July, you might actually find at local garden centers. Anderson Seed, I think, carries this one and starts, but Burpee or Gurney does too. And so all of these should be okay. And don't expect big sandwich sized tomatoes. You're expecting anywhere from 1 to 3 or 4 ounces. Now, one I did not include here that I probably should have is Early Girl. The reason I did it, it has like a 65 to 70-day ripening time. And so if you grow Early Girl, you will get 4 to 6 ounce sized tomatoes, but they won't ripen probably until late August into September in your area. All right, sweet corn. So soil temperature should be around 60. Here's your row spacing and all the information you need here. Um, it, Corn needs lots of fertilizer. If you have really anemic ears that are smaller than they should be and have smaller kernels, it's usually a lack of fertilizer. But the corn, when you go shopping online, will be separated into what's called SU. These are heirloom varieties, standard sweetness, and that's what grandma and grandpa grew. But then you've got sugar enhanced, which became popular in the 70s and 80s. They'll last for a few days refrigerated. And the latest ones that you usually find are called super sweet or shrunken. And it's shrunken because if you were to dry your ears of corn down, the kernels they shrink a little bit, and that's where it gets its name. They have a high sugar content. And then there's what's called synergistic, which is a mix of these two here. And so one complaint about the SH2 corns is that sometimes they're a little too sweet, and people will say they don't have that traditional corn flavor. So synergistic corn combines SH2 and sugar enhanced to get that sweetness to bring some more flavor in. But all of this is kind of a moot point for Rich County because most corn requires 70 to 90 days or even 100 days to ripen. And so I did find two varieties that should ripen in Rich County. But notice these are kind of smaller ears, but they still are ears of corn. Yukon Chief was by far the most popular online because it will ripen it germinates in cooler soil and it tolerates cooler temperatures a little better. But there were also recommendations for this early sun glow. Okay, let's move on to peppers. My goal here was, besides the onions, was to be able to help you grow a salsa garden. And so we've got two of the three ingredients here. And of the peppers, you're going to start them 8 weeks ahead of your last frost because they require 8 weeks before they're ready to be planted outside. Or you could go to a garden center and purchase them. But by mid to late June, even in Logan, your selection might be a little bit diminished. And because of your short growing season, you may have to grow your own. Across the board, this chocolate bell was one that was a short season. Peppers like a little bit of heat. And so I would recommend at least growing it on the black plastic. But there's this jalapeno. There should be a little dash right there. That's an early season jalapeno. And then the shishito is a Japanese sweet pepper that looks a little bit more like a jalapeno, but it's fairly sweet. These are three varieties I found online that would ripen in a relatively short growing season. So peppers, especially when you have temperatures above 90, have a tendency, the fruit on them has a tendency to scald on the side that faces the sun. So you may not have that problem as much up there, but I recommend planting peppers in a square or a rectangle instead of a row. Okay, let's look at green beans. The two early ones I could find, and there may be others, were Blue Lake Bush and Early Contender. I've grown both of these and they're both fantastic beans. Blue Lake Bush is mostly stringless. So there is that, but Contender is a great green bean. So here's some planting instructions on it. When a stagger planting, that's kind of funny. You could do that in Logan or the Wasatch Front, but those are two very short season green beans. But again, you're putting holes in that black plastic and growing up through it. Okay, Swiss chard. A lot of greens. You're cool enough to grow them all summer, but Swiss chard seems to be a little bit more heat tolerant. This particular mix is called Bright Lights, but there's Fort Hook Giant and Lucullus are two other very common ones. You should get a good season out of these no matter what, but they can be used as cut greens in a salad, or you can cook them. My parents used them kind of like spinach, to where they would parboil them and put butter and just a little bit of vinegar on them, maybe a little bit of garlic. But I should include Swiss chard is the same species as beets. I don't think I got beets in here, but you should be able to grow beets just fine also. Okay, lettuce. This is one that there are, and I don't have them in here, but there are types of lettuce that are more resistant to bolting. And that's when they get exposed to hot weather and go to seed. And so if you found hot weather tolerant lettuce, I would suspect, especially in Randolph, that you could grow it most of the summer and you can plant it several weeks ahead of your average last frost. And so you would get some decent harvests out of it. There's a valley in Wyoming that it hasn't been used in years, but Del Monte used to grow summer lettuce because it was high elevation and it never got above about 80 or so. And so in the Intermountain West, before they consolidated all their vegetable growing to California, there was areas of Wyoming that lettuce was grown because of the cool growing season during the summer. Okay, peas. These are ones that many peas have a fairly long growing season, but they need to be kept at temperatures below 80 to be happy. And so some garden peas, these are the ones that you shell. Little Marvel has a 62-day growing season, and this Avola right here has a 60-day growing season. And then as far as snap peas or sugar peas, the Sugar Ann is one that would work. Many peas have a 70 or 75-day growing season requirement, and these are the shortest season ones I could find. Okay, let's look at radishes. So soil temperature is above 40 again, but radishes will mature in anywhere from 25 to 45 days. And you should be able to grow these except for maybe in July. And if you had just a little bit of shade, you might be able to do it all summer. But radishes are one that I like them in salad. There's actually recipes. You can broil them, you can use them in soups and things. When I was on a diet a couple of years ago, one of the vegetables that they recommended eating were radishes. And I learned a lot of different ways to cook those things. But I like to broil them and then put just an olive oil and garlic and onion salt type uh, and they were okay. They're not my favorite, but they were okay. So, but radishes are one that you should be able to grow. And this is my last slide here. And so I will open up to questions. Turn my camera back on. Come on, camera. Okay. So, any questions? You can put it in the chat, or if you want to be brave, you can actually turn your mic on and ask that way too.
So maybe I have a question, Taun.
Okay.
Um, so when you are starting indoors, what what would be a recommended setup, like just to start out?
Well, let me get out of this PowerPoint and I'll show you this card. Okay. So I'll move you over here for just a second, hop online. And let's see. I want a seed starting bench. So let me share my screen again. And let's see. Get that big. And this one. So something like this, but you can build a wooden frame, but these will either have LED or fluorescent lights in them. And the biggest trick to starting your own vegetables is knowing the timing, how many weeks ahead that you need to start things. But the other thing to be aware of is the light. And I would actually park this next to a window so that I was getting supplemental light from a window. And this one is $500. That's way too much. You can get something similar on Amazon with 4 racks for around 120, or you can just buy, like I'm highlighting with my let me get my my highlighter pen. If it'll let me, at any rate, um you can buy just the individual light kits, or you can even go to a hardware store and get fluorescent shop lights and build a wooden frame with chains on it. But this system right here is very useful because during the winter, you can grow greens and lettuce on it, and then you can start all your outdoor stuff on it at the appropriate times.
Okay, and then maybe briefly, because I'm new to gardening too, so I learned so much, Taun. Thank you. What about transitioning from starting the plant indoors to planting in outdoors in your garden?
Okay. So for that, what I would do is just like you start your tomatoes 6 weeks ahead of your average last frost, or if you're using season extending methods like the plastic cover or walls of water, a couple of weeks ahead. But what I would do is when those tomatoes are a month old, is on a warmer day when you're in the mid 60s or low 70s, bring them out to the shade for 2 or 3 hours and then bring them back in. The next day, if you've got warm weather, maybe leave them in the shade all day, bring them back in, and then put them in the sun for a half day. But over 3 or 4 days, you can transition them. And it's not that the leaves that are currently on, say, your peppers or tomatoes, will just magically adjust. But what will happen is the new growth will. And so you might get a little scorch on those old leaves, but it tells the plant no more of you being coddled indoors. You're going outside and it will adjust and grow leaves that will tolerate the brighter sunlight. The other thing you can do is indoors, if you brush your plants lightly once a day with like a feather duster or your hand and just brush over the tops, it mimics wind and it strengthens the stems quite a bit. A fan, if you have an oscillating fan that blows on the plants, that will help minimize fungal diseases sometimes. And that wind, again, from the fan helps strengthen the stems. So, other questions?
Okay. So I guess if we don't have any more questions, thank Taun again. For those of you who joined late in the chat, our slides that Taun used, so you can go ahead and if you want them, they're in the chat. Also, I recorded this meeting, and if you want the recording, just let me know, and I can
Let
send it to
me there. I got in and out, and some people came in late. And if they came
you.
in late, the chat doesn't show up. So
Oh, that's right.
here's the link again. I'll leave it up further. And so if you want to click on that, you can download the slides from the presentation.
Okay. Thank you so much, Taun. Like I said earlier, I learned so much.
Oh,
So
you're
thank
welcome.
you. Those of you who are on, if you have any questions about gardening, you can ask me. And also, like Taun said in his presentation, the USU Extension website has so many great tips, so many fact
So
sheets.
the Facebook has a group called Utah Gardening Experts, and it's an extension sponsored gardening group that has, I think they're up to almost 20,000 members. And a great place to get good advice is on Utah Gardening Experts on Facebook. That's monitored by a horticulturist out of Salt Lake County. And so that's a great resource too.
Okay.
Okay.
Well,
Anything
thanks again,
else?
Tom.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, everyone.